Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Wonder. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating topic that might completely change the way you see the world. Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to discover is surprising, mysterious, and incredibly interesting. Part 1. The Spare, the Shadow, and the Sovereign's curse. The crown of England was never forged to rest upon the brow of Henry Tudor. In the twilight years of the 15th century, the boy born within the coastal sanctuary of Greenwich Palace was a secondary thought. A royal insurance policy wrapped in velvet and hidden beneath the grand, looming shadow of his elder brother. Arthur was the dawn of the Tudor dynasty. Henry was merely the dusk. To understand the psychological labyrinth of the man who would eventually rupture Western Christendom, one must understand the young prince who spent his formative years breathing the suffocating air of invisibility. His father, Henry VII, was a cold, transactional monarch who viewed his family not through the lens of paternal affection, but as pieces upon a geopolitical chessboard. Arthur was meticulously tutored in the exhausting arts of statecraft, groomed to embody the perfect Christian prince, and betrothed to the daughter of Spain's fiercest monarchs. Henry, meanwhile, was left to the periphery, destined perhaps for the silent cloisters of the church or a quiet, subservient dukedom. The world was told to look at Arthur and see the future. Then, the sweating sickness of 1502 struck like a phantom in the night. Within the damp walls of Ludlow Castle, Prince Arthur gasped his last breath at the tender age of 15, leaving behind a blank throne, a weeping kingdom, and a bewildered Spanish virgin widow named Catherine of Aragon. Overnight, the universe shifted on its axis. The 10-year-old Spare was dragged from the shadows into the blinding light of dynastic expectation. The paranoid, penny-pinching Henry VII looked at his sole remaining son not with pride, but with a terrifying, suffocating anxiety. The Tudor claim to the throne was not an ancient, immutable truth. It was a fresh scar won on the bloody mud of Bosworth Field. Yorkist pretenders still whispered in the dark, and the crown was a fragile thing that could be easily shattered without a direct, unbroken line of male inheritance. Young Henry was locked away, heavily guarded. Forbidden from making a single move without his father's direct supervision. He grew up in an atmosphere thick with suspicion, learning early that survival depended entirely upon absolute control and the generation of unquestionable legitimacy. When the old king finally expired in the spring of 1509, England did not merely mourn, it erupted into absolute ecstasy. The young Henry VIII ascended the throne at 17 years old, looking less like a mortal man and more like a golden Renaissance deity descended from Mount Olympus. He was a breathtaking spectacle, well over 6 feet tall, fiercely athletic, with hair like spun copper and an energy that electrified the drab, paranoid halls of Westminster. He was an intellectual chameleon, conversing effortlessly in Latin, French, and Italian, composing intricate musical court pieces and debating theology with the finest minds of Europe. He was a king who could outride his huntsmen, outjoust his knights, and outdance his courtiers until the morning sun broke through the leaded windows. "The heavens laugh, the earth exults," wrote the ecstatic scholar Thomas More. The dark, miserly winter of the first Tudor king was dead. The glorious, extravagant summer of the sun had finally arrived. Yet, beneath the glittering gold cloth and the magnificent feasts, an insatiable monster was quietly stirring. Henry did not merely wish to govern England. He wanted to dominate history. He looked across the English Channel at the battlefields of France and dreamed of reclaiming the ancestral glories of Henry V. He craved immortality. And in the 16th century, immortality for a monarch was spelled in only one way: sons. A king without a male heir was a king whose house was built upon shifting sand. He needed a queen who could match his majesty, secure his borders, and flood his nursery with healthy princes. It was an obsession rooted not in vanity, but in a profound, existential terror of a return to the civil butcheries of the Wars of the Roses. The first step in this grand quest for dynastic permanence felt like a chivalric romance. Henry cast his eyes upon Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, who had been left languishing in near poverty by the diplomatic maneuverings of two ruthless fathers. To marry her was an act of profound political calculation masked as youthful gallantry. It preserved the vital Spanish alliance, kept a staggering dowry within the English treasury, and gave Henry a queen of impeccable royal lineage. There was, however, a dark theological cloud hanging over the union. The Catholic Church strictly forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife, viewing it as a transgression against biblical law. But the young king was undeterred. A special papal dispensation was swiftly procured from Rome, built upon Catherine's solemn, sacred oath that her brief marriage to Arthur had never been consummated in the marital bed. On a glorious June day, they were crowned together, their futures inextricably bound. For the first decade, the marriage was an idyllic tapestry of mutual respect and shared intellect. Catherine was no passive ornament. She was a fierce, formidable daughter of Isabella of Castile. When Henry sailed across the sea to chase military phantoms in France, he left Catherine as regent of England. It was a trust she repaid in blood. When the Scottish army seized upon the king's absence and invaded the northern borders, Catherine did not cower in Windsor. She rode north, pregnant and clad in armor, delivering a stirring speech to her troops. The resulting English victory at the Battle of Flodden crushed the Scottish nobility and left their king dead on the field. Catherine sent her husband a fragment of James IV's blood-stained coat as a victory trophy. They were a golden couple, invincible and adored. But behind the closed doors of the royal bedchamber, a quiet, devastating tragedy was unfolding in agonizing slow motion. The nursery remained haunted by silence. Part 2. The Great Matter and the Crimson Scaffold. The tragedy of Catherine of Aragon was written in the quiet rustle of shifting silk and the muffled sobs of a mother mourning the dead. Between the years of 1510 and 1518, the Queen of England entered the dark valley of childbirth at least 6 times. Each pregnancy was met with frantic prayers, a flurry of astrological predictions, and the desperate hope of a kingdom. Yet, the harvest of her womb was nothing but heartbreak. There were sudden, devastating miscarriages, stillborn boys who looked like marble statues, and one beautiful prince, christened Henry, who survived for just 52 glorious days before his tiny heart stopped beating, plunging the court from triumph into absolute despair. Out of all those agonizing years of blood and tears, only one child clung stubbornly to life. A clever, pale-faced girl named Mary, born in the winter of 1516. Henry loved the child, cradling her in his massive arms and boasting of her intelligence to foreign ambassadors. But a daughter was an incomplete answer to an absolute question. England had never been successfully ruled by a woman. The solitary precedent, Empress Matilda centuries earlier, had plunged the nation into decades of catastrophic anarchy. By the mid-1520s, the Golden Prince had begun to coarsen. The athletic lines of his youth were thickening, the agonizing ulcers on his legs were beginning to weep, and his hair was losing its copper fire. Catherine, older than her husband and worn down by the physical trauma of failed pregnancies, had entered her 41st year. The biological window was slamming shut. Henry looked at his aging wife and saw not a loyal partner, but a divine rejection. His theological mind, always prone to convenient self-delusion, fastened onto a terrifying passage in the book of Leviticus, *, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless. * to Henry, the lack of a male heir was not a medical misfortune. It was the literal handwriting of God upon the wall, damning his marriage as incestuous. An invalid. He had offended the Almighty by taking Arthur's widow, and the death of his sons was the divine punishment. He needed an exit, a clean slate, and a new womb. Enter and Boleyn. She was not a classic beauty of the Tudor court. She lacked the pale, porcelain skin and flaxen hair valued by the era. Instead, she possessed a dark, electric magnetism that defied convention. Educated in the sophisticated, glittering courts of Brussels and Paris, and was a master of the courtly game. She possessed flashing obsidian eyes, a razor-sharp wit, and a sophisticated, avant-garde style that made every other woman in Westminster appear provincial. Henry was utterly consumed. He pursued her with an erratic intensity, showering her with agonizingly passionate love letters and glittering jewels. And had watched her own sister, Mary, be discarded by the king after a brief, casual affair. She refused to become a royal plaything, a passing mist in the king's bed. She gave Henry an ultimatum that was both intoxicating and dangerous. She would give him her maidenhead only if he gave her his crown. This was the spark that ignited what history would call the king's great matter. For 6 agonizing years, Henry attempted to bend the machinery of the Catholic Church to his will. He demanded that Pope Clement VII annul his marriage to Catherine, expecting Rome to comply with the requests of a loyal, Orthodox king. But the Pope was trapped in a geopolitical vice. Rome had been brutally sacked by the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's fiercely protective nephew. The Pope could not invalidate the marriage without signing his own death warrant. The case dragged through specialized legate courts, culminating in a dramatic showdown at Blackfriars in 1529. Catherine, showing the indomitable spirit of her crusading parents, bypassed the judges, walked directly across the courtroom, and threw herself at Henry's feet. In a voice that trembled with emotion but never broke, she pleaded for her honor, her daughter's legitimacy, and her 20 years of stainless loyalty. Henry sat frozen, refusing to look his queen in the eye. The political deadlock broke Henry's patience and transformed his soul. If the Pope would not grant him a divorce, Henry would simply destroy the Pope's authority over England. Guided by the ruthless, bureaucratic genius of Thomas Cromwell and the reformist theology of Thomas Cranmer, Henry enacted a legal revolution. Through a series of sweeping parliamentary statutes, he severed England's 1,000-year-old umbilical cord to Rome. He declared the English Church independent and pronounced himself the supreme head of the Church of England. It was an act of breathtaking tyranny and unparalleled audacity. Monasteries were systematically dissolved, their ancient wealth poured directly into the royal treasury. Those who refused to swear an oath acknowledging Henry's spiritual supremacy, including his closest friend, Thomas More, had their heads hacked off on Tower Hill. In the winter of 1533, Henry married a secretly pregnant and Boleyn, and Cranmer officially declared the marriage to Catherine null and void. Catherine was banished from court, stripped of her title as queen, and downgraded to the Dowager Princess of Wales. She was separated from her beloved daughter Mary and sent to live in a succession of damp, isolated castles, where she lived out her days as a political prisoner in her own adopted country. She died in January 1536, her final letter to Henry declaring, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." Henry and celebrated her death by dressing in vibrant yellow and hosting a celebratory joust. But Anne's triumph was a hollow shell. On September 7, 1533, she had gone into her magnificent childbed and delivered not the promised prince, but a healthy girl named Elizabeth. Henry's heart hardened instantly. The magnificent break with Rome, the blood of martyrs, the destruction of his kingdom's peace, all of it had been risked for another daughter. Anne's position deteriorated with terrifying speed. She was not like Catherine. She could not suffer in silence. She was volatile, demanding, and politically outspoken, frequently arguing with Henry in public. As the miscarriages mounted, including the devastating loss of a male fetus in early 1536, Henry began to feel the familiar, toxic creep of superstitious resentment. He had traded one barren marriage for another. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, recognizing that the king's love had curdled into hatred, moved with lethal efficiency. A monstrous web of conspiracy was spun around the queen, and was arrested and accused of high treason, plotting the king's death, and committing incestuous adultery with 5 courtiers, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The trials were a dark farce. The evidence was physically impossible, but the verdict was preordained. On May 19, 1536, and stepped onto a black scaffold built within the grounds of the Tower of London. Clad in a dark damask gown, she looked out at the silent crowd and praised the king's mercy. Henry, in a final act of grotesque chivalry, had imported a specialized swordsman from Calais to perform the execution. With a single, elegant sweep of the steel blade, and Boleyn's head was severed, her bleeding body unceremoniously crammed into an old arrow chest and buried beneath the stones of a cold chapel. Part 3. The ghost of the nursery and the German trapped the blood of and Boleyn was barely dry on the straw of the scaffold when Henry VIII climbed into his royal saddle to ride toward his third marriage. The man who had entered his reign as a hopeful romantic had evolved into an absolute pragmatist who viewed the sacrament of marriage as a clinical, biological transaction. The woman waiting for him in the wings was Jane Seymour. If and Boleyn had been an intoxicating, exotic liquor, Jane was a cool cup of spring water. She was pale, plain-featured, and perpetually quiet, adopting as her personal motto the submissive phrase, bound to obey and serve. Having served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne, Jane had enjoyed a front-row seat to the lethal theater of the Tudor court. She understood with absolute clarity that survival lay in complete self-effacement. She never offered her opinions on statecraft. She never engaged in witty theological debates. She simply existed as a soothing, docile balm for a king whose mind was increasingly plagued by paranoia, and physical agony. They were married in May 1536, a mere 11 days after Anne's execution. Henry was desperate for the validation of a pregnancy, but the months dragged on in an excruciating, tense silence. The king's anxiety reached a fever pitch. If Jane proved barren, it would imply that God was still displeased with him, that the break with Rome had been an exercise in futility. But in the early spring of 1537, the joyous announcement finally echoed through the halls of Hampton Court Palace. The Queen was with child. Henry treated her like a fragile glass ornament, fulfilling her every eccentric dietary craving and canceling royal progresses to ensure her absolute rest. On October 12, 1537, after a grueling, terrifying labor that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, Jane gave birth to a pale, perfectly formed boy. He was christened Edward. The kingdom went absolutely wild with joy. Bonfires illuminated the night sky from Cornwall to Berwick. Wine flowed freely from the public conduits of London, and cannons boomed from the walls of the tower. Henry wept openly as he held the infant prince, believing that his decades of spiritual warfare had finally been vindicated by the Almighty. He had his heir. The Tudor line was secure, but the dynastic victory was instantly poisoned by tragedy. Jane had been shattered by the prolonged delivery. Within days of the christening, she sank into the delirium of childbed fever, her body consumed by an unstoppable postpartum infection. On October 24th, she breathed her last. Henry was plunged into a deep, authentic grief that shocked his courtiers. For months, he cocooned himself in heavy black mourning weeds, refusing to see visitors and seeking solace in eating. Jane had achieved immortality in Henry's mind precisely because she died at the absolute peak of her utility. She had given him the son he craved and had vanished before her wit could anger him or her body could fail her. She remained, forever frozen in his memory, as the ideal, perfect wife. For over 2 years, the king remained a bitter widower. But by 1539, the geopolitical landscape of Europe was shifting dangerously. The Catholic superpowers of France and the Holy Roman Empire had signed a peace treaty, raising the terrifying prospect of a joint crusade against the heretical Kingdom of England.